What happened before the flood didn't end with the flood. Not everything God judged was human, and not everything he judged was forgiven. Scripture often speaks about mercy, about patience, about correction. But there are moments where none of that appears. Moments where God does not explain, does not warn, does not negotiate. He removes. This is one of those moments. This is not a story about mythology. It is not a story about ancient imagination. It is a pattern that begins with delegated authority and ends with erasure. And the most unsettling part is this: the line that was crossed back then is the same line being tested today. From the beginning, the biblical world is not chaotic, it is structured. Authority does not emerge randomly, it flows. There is a center and there are extensions. Order moves outward, not sideways. God does not control everything directly. That idea is comforting but incomplete. Instead, authority is delegated, assigned, entrusted, given with limits. This is where most people misunderstand power. Delegated authority is not ownership, it is not permanence, and it is never unconditional. It exists only as long as it remains aligned with the purpose for which it was given. To guide, not to dominate. To protect, not to replace. To reflect, not to redefine. The moment authority forgets this, it becomes unstable. And instability at the level of authority does not stay contained. It spreads downward. Scripture repeatedly shows that the greatest threats do not come from rebellion at the bottom, but distortion at the top. When authority remains aligned, it creates order. When it turns inward, it creates dependency. And dependency is always a warning sign, because anything that needs dependence to survive is no longer serving, it is feeding. Delegated authority was meant to create space for growth, not obedience for its own sake, not loyalty extracted through fear. Growth requires freedom, and freedom requires restraint from those in power. That restraint is what separates authority from control, but restraint is fragile. It demands humility, the constant awareness that power can be taken back. Once authority begins to forget that it can be revoked, it begins to behave as if it cannot. That is the moment the structure starts to crack, not visibly, not dramatically, quietly, through entitlement, through justification, through the belief that order depends on me. This is the most dangerous thought any authority can have. Because once authority believes it is essential, it stops serving the system and starts protecting itself. And when authority exists to preserve itself, it is no longer aligned. It has crossed the first line. Delegated authority was never meant to be self-sustaining. It was meant to be responsive, accountable, temporary if necessary. But when accountability disappears, authority stops listening upward. It no longer reflects. It begins to decide. At that point, correction becomes difficult, and reversal becomes unlikely. This is why Scripture treats authority failures with such seriousness, because when authority collapses, everything beneath it suffers, not immediately, not all at once, but inevitably. That is why judgment often begins not with the many, but with the few who were trusted to guide them. And that is why the removal described later was not sudden. It was the final outcome of a long deviation. Authority had stopped serving. And once that happens, the question is no longer if it will be judged, but when. Delegated authority does not collapse overnight. It drifts. The transition is subtle, almost invisible, because it does not begin with cruelty. It begins with certainty. Those entrusted to guide begin to believe they know what is best, not as a responsibility, but as a right. At first, nothing appears wrong. Order remains, systems function, structure holds. But something shifts beneath the surface. Guidance slowly becomes direction. Direction becomes expectation. Expectation becomes obligation. And obligation over time becomes control. This is the point where authority stops asking and starts assuming. It no longer listens upward for alignment. It listens inward for justification. What was once stewardship begins to redefine itself as necessity. Without us, this falls apart. That belief is intoxicating, because once authority believes it is essential, it no longer tolerates limits. Limits feel like threats. Accountability feels like interference. And freedom beneath authority begins to look like disorder. This is where domination is born, not through violence, but through dependency. Those under authority are no longer guided to maturity. They are kept in reliance. Reliance becomes loyalty. Loyalty becomes submission, and submission is framed as peace. But peace built on submission is fragile. It requires constant enforcement. This is the moment when authority begins to demand recognition, not worship, not yet, but validation. Acknowledgement, dependence, and dependence is the clearest signal that authority has lost its purpose, because guidance aims at independence, domination aims at permanence. Authority that guides works toward its own irrelevance. Authority that dominates works toward its own survival. These two cannot coexist. Once domination begins, the system stops producing growth and starts producing fear. Fear of disorder, fear of loss, fear of being replaced. And fear always accelerates control. Rules multiply, boundaries tighten, deviation is punished, not because it is destructive, but because it is threatening. At this stage, authority no longer protects those beneath it. It protects itself from them. This is why correction becomes impossible. Correction requires humility, but domination cannot afford humility. To admit error would weaken control. To release power would risk collapse. So domination doubles down. It reinforces itself. And in doing so, it crosses the line from misalignment into opposition. Opposition not necessarily against God directly, but against the design. Because the design was never submission without growth. It was guidance toward freedom. Once authority reverses that direction, it no longer serves the structure, it consumes it. This is the moment Scripture treats as irreversible, not because power has grown too strong, but because willingness to release it has disappeared. Domination does not ask to be corrected, it demands to be preserved. And anything that demands preservation above purpose has already forfeited legitimacy. From this point forward, judgment is no longer about behavior, it is about function. Authority has failed its reason for existing, and once authority reaches this stage, there is no reform, only removal. Every system reaches a moment where change is no longer corrective, not because power has become absolute, but because willingness has disappeared. This is the moment Scripture rarely dramatizes. There is no explosion, no visible rebellion, no public collapse, only rigidity. Authority stops responding, not outwardly, but inwardly. It no longer asks whether it is aligned. It only asks whether it is secure. At this stage, correction fails for a simple reason. Correction requires consent. It requires the capacity to listen, to absorb, to release. But authority that defines itself by control cannot release control. To do so would threaten its identity. So every warning becomes noise. Every boundary feels hostile. Every call to humility is reinterpreted as danger. This is where escalation stops making sense. Warnings no longer function as mercy. They function as reinforcement. They validate the belief that authority is under attack. And once authority believes it is under attack, it becomes defensive. Defensive systems do not change. They fortify, they tighten, they entrench. This is why Scripture sometimes shows judgment without dialogue, not because God is impatient, but because dialogue has become impossible. The system has closed. It has reached the point where any attempt to correct it only strengthens the very behavior that must be stopped. At this stage, authority is no longer misaligned, it is oppositional. Not openly rebellious, but structurally incompatible with the design it was meant to serve. This is the moment of no return, where delay increases damage, where tolerance becomes complicity, where mercy, if extended, would preserve the threat. And this is the part that unsettles most readers, because it suggests that mercy has limits, not limits imposed by anger, but by reality. Forgiveness restores relationship, but restoration assumes that relationship is still possible. Here, it is not. The structure has hardened. The authority has fused with its control. It cannot step down without collapsing, and so it will not step down. From this point forward, judgment is no longer about moral failure. It is about containment. You do not reason with a system that has become self-preserving. You dismantle it. This is why the judgment described next is clean, decisive, without negotiation, not because God refuses to forgive, but because forgiveness would no longer heal anything. The goal is no longer restoration. It is protection. Protection of what remains, protection of what could still grow. This is the moment Scripture marks without ceremony, because ceremony would invite reflection, and reflection would invite replication. The text moves forward as if to say, this was not meant to be revisited. Once authority reaches this stage, history does not need details, only outcomes, and the outcome is always the same: removal. Forgiveness is one of the most repeated themes in Scripture. It is expected, it is promised, it is celebrated. So when forgiveness is absent, the absence feels intentional, and it is. Forgiveness is not automatic, it is relational. It restores what can still function. It repairs what is still flexible. It heals what is still alive. But forgiveness does not override structure. It does not pretend that damage disappears. It does not preserve systems that cannot sustain alignment. In this case, forgiveness was never presented as an option, not because mercy was withheld, but because mercy would not have solved the problem. Mercy restores connection. But connection requires mutuality. It requires recognition. It requires the willingness to step back, and that willingness no longer existed. Authority had fused with control. Control had fused with identity. To remove control would have meant to dismantle the very self-definition of those in power, and so restoration was no longer possible. Forgiveness assumes that something can return to its intended function. But here, function had been redefined. Guidance had become dominance. Stewardship had become preservation of self. The design was no longer being reflected. It was being replaced. This is where mercy reaches its limit. Not because mercy is weak, but because mercy cannot coexist with permanence of distortion. If forgiveness had been extended, what would it have restored? The same authority, the same control, the same structural imbalance. Nothing would have changed. And mercy without change is not mercy. It is tolerance of harm. This is the part that unsettles modern readers, because we prefer the idea that forgiveness is always the highest outcome. But Scripture presents something deeper. Alignment is the highest outcome. And when alignment cannot be re-established, removal becomes protection. This was not emotional judgment, it was structural intervention. The problem was not behavior alone, it was permanence. Once authority decides it cannot release power, it cannot be reformed from within. It must be interrupted from above, and interruption at that level does not look like correction. It looks like erasure, not because God refuses to forgive, but because forgiveness would preserve instability. Think about what forgiveness would imply: continuation, reinstatement, trust extended again. But trust requires humility, and humility was no longer present. The absence of forgiveness in this moment is not cruelty, it is clarity. Clarity that some structures cannot be repaired. clarity that some systems cannot be restored, clarity that some authority cannot be trusted again. This is why the judgment was final. No probation, no second assignment, no rehabilitation, just removal. Because the purpose of authority is not to exist indefinitely, it is to serve. And once service becomes impossible, existence loses its justification. Forgiveness restores servants. Removal dismantles tyrants. And in this case, only one option remained. After the removal, something unusual happens. The story does not linger. There is no detailed account, no aftermath, no explanation meant to satisfy curiosity. The narrative moves on. And that silence is not accidental. In Scripture, silence often carries more meaning than description, because description invites analysis, analysis invites fascination, and fascination invites repetition. What was removed was not meant to be revisited, not studied, not expanded, not remembered in detail. The danger was not only what these beings had become. The danger was what could happen if their pattern was understood too well. Memory preserves influence. To remember is to keep something alive in thought, and what remains alive in thought eventually seeks form again. So the record is minimal, enough to warn, not enough to replicate. This is why the details feel deliberately incomplete. No names worth repeating, no hierarchies worth mapping, no systems worth reconstructing. Because reconstruction would invite imitation. The erasure was not only physical, it was narrative. The absence itself became the safeguard. This challenges a modern instinct. We want everything explained. We believe understanding equals control. But Scripture suggests something else. Some understanding does not bring control. It brings temptation. It brings the illusion that what failed once can succeed if done differently. That illusion is dangerous. Because the pattern that led to erasure was not a technical mistake, it was a structural one. Authority fused with permanence, control fused with identity. Those conditions do not change with better execution. They repeat, so the silence remains, not as punishment, as protection. Protection for what could still grow. Protection for what could still develop freely. The erasure created space for humanity to continue without the pressure of distorted authority. Space for growth without enforced dependence. Space for freedom to mature slowly. That space mattered more than preserving memory. This is why Scripture does not invite reflection here. It invites movement. It does not ask the reader to analyze the erased. It asks the reader to learn from the absence, because the absence itself is the lesson. When authority becomes incompatible with freedom, it is not corrected publicly. It is removed quietly, and the record moves forward so that the pattern is not admired, but avoided. This is why the story does not end with warning or commentary. It ends with silence, because silence closes doors. And some doors must remain closed for life to continue. The pattern did not end with what was erased. It continued, not in the same form, not with the same names, but with the same structure, because the issue was never the beings themselves. It was the pattern they embodied. Delegated authority that refuses to release control always moves toward the same outcome. It begins by guiding, then directing, then deciding, and eventually replacing. This pattern appears wherever authority exists, in institutions, in systems, in beliefs, in individuals. Any authority that cannot tolerate accountability begins to isolate itself. It stops listening, it stops adapting, it stops serving. Correction becomes interference. Boundaries become threats. At that point, authority no longer exists for what it governs. It exists for itself. This is the same line that was crossed before, and it is crossed quietly. Not through rebellion, but through justification. Through the belief that order depends on control. Through the fear that releasing power will lead to collapse. But freedom was always part of the design, and authority that suppresses freedom eventually suppresses growth. Scripture does not present this as ancient history. It presents it as warning, because whenever the same conditions return, the same outcome follows. Correction is offered only as long as change is possible. When change is refused, removal becomes inevitable, not as punishment, but as protection. Protection of what can still grow. This is why the story does not end with what was erased. It ends with what remains. What remains is the responsibility to recognize the pattern before it hardens again, because the line still exists, and it is crossed not by power, but by unwillingness to release it. Some things can be forgiven, others must be removed, and that difference is what keeps the structure intact. Authority was never erased because it existed. It was erased because it refused to end. That is the difference most people miss. Power is not condemned in Scripture. Control is. Guidance is not judged. Domination is. Forgiveness is extended where change is possible. But where authority decides it will never release itself, forgiveness no longer heals. It preserves the threat. What was removed was not misunderstood. It was incompatible. Incompatible with freedom. Incompatible with growth. Incompatible with a design that depends on choice. That is why there was no appeal, no restoration, no return. Because some structures cannot be corrected without collapsing, and some collapses are necessary for life to continue. The story does not ask you to fear authority. It asks you to recognize it, to recognize the moment when guidance becomes control, when service becomes entitlement, when power begins to protect itself instead of what it was meant to serve. That moment is the line. And that line is rarely crossed loudly. It is crossed quietly, through certainty, through justification, through the belief that order depends on holding on. But order was never sustained by control. It was sustained by alignment. When alignment disappears, authority loses its right to exist. Some things can be forgiven, others must be removed, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Because when authority refuses to let go, it does not fall. It is erased.